I don't necessarily believe, and I don't think we should be convinced or allow people to convince us that user-generated content is going to take over the world or is the only thing that we need to get involved in. Because, you know, a cat falling off a piano is funny once, unless it's your cat, in which case you might be worried. But it does start to get tired. Even Jeremy Beadle started to realise that. So people still want professionally produced content. If you look at the, I think it's 110, 120 videos that have received more than 100 million views online, 80% of them are professionally produced content in some way, shape or form. There's a lot of movie trailers in there, there's a lot of music videos, there's clips from comedians. Has anyone seen the Evolution of Dance, which is the, I'm not going to try it, please believe it, which is the 60 seconds where the guy goes from sort of Elvis to Michael Jackson and does all the dance moves in between. Now, a lot of people would have you believe that's user-generated content because it's on a home camera and it's slightly shaky, but of course, the guy's a professional dancer, he's a professional entertainer, he's in a theatre where people have paid to get in. Just because some bugger filmed him without his approval doesn't stop it being professionally produced content. It's just it's user-shared content. And I think this is the important thing, is that users want to share content, but generally they still want the same standard as they had done in the past. So, an example, and if you want great entertainment, there's nothing like our glorious leader, Mr. Cowan, who of course on Morning Island in September 2010 went on and allegedly may have been out quite late the night before. We've all done that. There's nothing wrong with that. I only got in at 6 o'clock is when I did. So what was interesting there is that this guy goes on the radio, a medium that many people would have you believe is dead, and what happens is that someone is listening to the radio and someone tweets about it. And it was the radio that inspired the tweet that then went around the world and got picked up by all the other news stations and all the other media channels and got him onto, I think it was even on the Jay Leno show. So it often still takes the traditional media and the professional content to spark the discussion that happens in the social network. Again, you have Irish, you know, during the snowstorms, you then had people responding to a professionally produced piece of content, which is an update, as Norm said, about what's happening outside. And the main reason I put this up there is to just to, you know, if they can't get the railways running, how the hell were we meant to do our conference last December? So this is our way of an apology. And I think the thing that really sort of brings this to life and sort of crystallises it is the fact that now essentially, if we're talking about mainstream media, if we're talking about the single biggest media channel, the single biggest media event in the country, it's not, I'm afraid, the Sunday Independent, it's not, I'm afraid, the Late Late Show, it's not, I'm afraid, Hello, even the X Factor Morning Island or the RTE Guide, it is Facebook. So Facebook is now the single biggest media channel, and as Norm said earlier, the thing that people do on Facebook more than anything else is they talk about TV. So what we always need to concentrate on is how we can integrate those two different channels to make sure that users can share professionally produced content that we have some say in, because of course the advertising budgets aren't necessarily what they used to be. So publishers, and I'm sure many of the people in the room here who are publishers would agree with me, and we're happy to talk to you about it afterwards, are looking at how brands can help them create that content. You know, they are looking for co-created content, for completely created branded content. I mean, look at The Apprentice. That is essentially branded content because every episode is paid for by a brand, and don't we love them for it? So, the final thing to say is it's not necessarily just for kids, because I think, again, that's been one of the claims about social media and the web in general, actually, is that it's mainly for the young audience and it's therefore not of interest to my audience. So what I think is interesting is probably the final barrier there ever was to an older audience integrating with technology of all shapes and forms is the user interface. So if you think about it, there used to be the sort of the slightly bad joke about the guy who's going off to, the young guy's going off to university and his mother's crying. He says, "Don't worry, Mum, please, don't cry. I'm going to be back in a couple of weeks." And she says, "I know, but who's going to program the video whilst you're away?" Because they couldn't. It was too complicated, right? And I mean, who can read the instructions on these things? But then when you look at the sort of devices that are coming out now, it becomes much, much easier. So a true story, and she never thanks me for telling it, but my mother was bought an iPod Touch a couple of years ago, and she uses it to essentially to check her emails. She's walking around the house. Now, she lives in France, and she came to visit me, and as all Apple products do, the batteries ran out. So I passed her my BlackBerry to check her email, and she started going like that. So she started trying to use it by touching it, because that was a much more obvious user interface. And as Norm said, you now have things that like Connect, where you can just wave at them. You have not just Google Goggles, which is image-based, you have Google Voice, where you can talk to things. Interestingly, of course, only last week, Google and Twitter came together and created a service for people in Egypt where, because the internet had been cut off, you could just ring a phone line, say something, and that would be turned into a tweet. So the fact that then you don't need to be able to understand the technology in order to interact with it, I think is going to make it only more and more of something that's going to be of interest to a wider audience. Okay, so that's enough of the theory. Let's have a look at how we would suggest putting this into practice. So this is the 4 easy steps, or the 4 things to think about before you jump on board. Because what often happens, of course, is that someone comes down in the morning, and the chief exec comes down, and his daughter's having the breakfast table, and she says, "Daddy, why aren't we on YouTube?" He's like, "I don't know, I'm going to go and ask my marketing director." He goes in, "Why aren't we on YouTube?" He's like, "Shit, I'm going to go ask the marketing manager." And all of a sudden, someone's on YouTube, but it's just because a 5-year-old girl wanted them to be, and no one's really sure exactly what the objectives are and what the point is. So there's four key things. I think it's the reason Bill Boyd, his son said, "Daddy, why aren't we on YouTube?" But anyway, so there's four key points here. Think about your aims. Think about your audience. Think about your approach, and of course, as with all forms of marketing, all forms of communications, you then need to analyse it to see whether you're successful. So, what do we mean by that? Your aims. I mean, it's kind of obvious, but what is the reason that you're actually going to get onto this into social media? What is it you're trying to do? Are you trying to drive sales? Are you trying to improve your organic search listings? I mean, that's the reason I sort of moved into social in the first place, is because it was a good way of driving links. When I was head of search, is that you get a lot of links from blogs, and that's going to prove it. So what exactly are your objectives? You need to set these out, and from that you will then start to realise what you should be doing, where you should be doing, and what sort of assets you're likely to need. So if you think about an example, this is something we did in the UK. So First Direct, I don't know if you're all familiar with First Direct, so it's a bank in the UK, and it started off as just a phone-only bank, and it's built itself on customer service, and it's obviously moved onto the web as so many other companies have. And over the last couple of years, banks in England, surprisingly, and as over here, haven't had such a great reputation. There's been a few things people haven't liked them as much as they maybe should have done. So the aim here was to remind people that First Direct was a trustworthy bank. And so then from that came the execution and the way they brought that to life, which essentially was they created a service which monitored what people were saying about First Direct online, so a buzz monitoring service essentially, and then actually started publishing that. So they were strong enough in their conviction that they could publish what people were saying about them online on a special section of their website. But then what we also did is we actually turned that into offline advertising. So there were digital billboards at Victoria Station with live tweets that people were saying, and a sort of a chart showing whether the percentage of negative, neutral or positive tweets were about them. So very clear objective, highlight the fact that we are a trusted brand and our consumers believe in us, and because we believe that recommendation is the way to a successful business, and from that came an execution, rather than actually saying, let's go and do something in social media, what should we do? So make sure you have very clear objectives.